Why was she carrying coffee when she should have been carrying command? That was the thought that flickered in the back of Allison Webb's mind as she stepped through the secure checkpoint at Naval Station B ashore. She didn't let it linger. Thoughts like that were dangerous. They made you stand taller, speak louder, and remind people of the truth you had tried so carefully to hide. The petty officer at the gate barely looked up from his clipboard before waving her through. To him, she was another civilian support worker, one of the invisible hundreds who kept the base humming with coffee, folders, and paperwork. The kind of worker you never learned the name of, but somehow expected to be there when you needed them. That was the role she had chosen, and most days she wore it like a shield. The October sun sat heavy on the California coast, painting the parking lot in bright glare. The air carried the sting of diesel from base vehicles and the salt tang of the Pacific. Allison adjusted the strap of the service tray she carried, the weight familiar, ordinary. Nothing about her presence suggested anything extraordinary. Not the plain Navy work uniform, not the careful economy of her movements, not the way she avoided eye contact as she moved toward Building 127. But there was something she carried that no one noticed, something she never spoke about. Inside the building, portraits of admirals lined the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow her, men and women remembered for strategy, for victory, for command. Allison's steps echoed down the hall toward the administrative offices. She paused, steadied her breathing. This was just another assignment, a logistics task, a coffee station, a stack of folders arranged by classification. She had done this 100 times. So why did today feel different? Chief Petty Officer Joan Kennedy looked up as Allison entered, her tone brisk but not unkind. Conference Room A is set up. Coffee station north wall, seating chart finalized, you're good. Kennedy was one of the few who treated her with professional respect. Even so, she never asked much about Allison's background. Nobody did. That was the point. Allison nodded, reviewing the Admiral's preferences from memory. Coffee at exactly 185 degrees. Folders sorted by clearance level. Meeting space optimized for both discussion and security. It was all routine, but in her mind there was always a checklist running deeper. Escape routes, choke points, who in the room carried weight and who just filled a chair. Old habits never faded, even when you tried to bury them under paper and coffee cups. By 1400 hours, the room was perfect. Coffee brewed to spec, materials laid out, secure video conference lines tested twice. On the surface, it was a day like any other. But in Allison's gut, there was a tension she couldn't shake. Maybe it was the number of last-minute additions to the attendee list. Maybe it was the unusual edge in Kennedy's voice. Or maybe it was something else, something she couldn't quite name. At 14:30, Admiral North arrived. Her voice carried down the corridor before she even entered the room, crisp, sharp, alive with the kind of authority that made people straighten without realizing they were doing it. North was known for her precision, for never missing details others overlooked. That alone made Allison's pulse quicken. Captain Douglas Miller walked in first, shoulders tight, posture stiff. Then Commander Evans. Then Lieutenant Hall from Intelligence. The room filled with the hum of rank and tension. Allison positioned herself by the coffee station, exactly where she belonged, essential but unseen. At 14:45, Admiral North entered, and the air shifted. She was smaller than Allison expected, but every movement radiated competence. She didn't raise her voice, but the room bent around her authority. "Good afternoon," she said. "Thank you for accommodating the adjustments. Let's begin." As North opened her portfolio and began asking questions, sharp, pointed, deliberate, Allison busied herself with creamers, sugar packets, the silent theater of service. But she listened. She always listened. "Underutilization of available expertise," North repeated, her tone edged with steel. "Are we speaking about personnel whose qualifications exceed their current assignments?" The silence that followed was heavy. Allison's jaw tightened, though she kept her head bowed. Evans tried to answer, vague and diplomatic. Miller followed with a bureaucratic dodge. Neither answer satisfied the Admiral. Invisible at her coffee station, Allison felt the sting of those words more than anyone realized. Underutilization. Expertise ignored. That was her life in one sentence. She poured another carafe, hands steady even as her chest tightened. The meeting pressed on, tension climbing. North asked questions that seemed to slice deeper each time. When Miller admitted, indirectly, that he hadn't reviewed the backgrounds of his civilian staff in detail, the Admiral's silence was louder than any reprimand. "Perhaps this would be an appropriate time for refreshments," she finally said. It was a simple request, but Allison heard what was beneath it, a pause to observe, to study. Admirals rarely wasted moments. She stepped forward with the carafe, moving between chairs, refilling cups with practiced invisibility. Then, as she leaned toward Admiral North, her collar shifted, just slightly. The metal caught the light, bronze, suspended from navy blue. Conversation froze. The room that moments before buzzed with tension went utterly silent. Admiral North's eyes locked on the metal. Not a decoration, not an ornament, a Navy cross, the kind of recognition that could not be mistaken, could not be fabricated, could not be ignored. Allison felt it instantly, the moment she had dreaded for 18 months, the moment her shield of anonymity cracked. "Thank you," Admiral North said softly, her gaze never leaving the ribbon. There was weight in her voice, a kind of respect that reached deeper than politeness. Allison nodded, retreating toward the safety of her coffee station, but North's voice stopped her in her tracks. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced." The silence stretched like fog rolling in from the Pacific. Every officer turned toward her. Some looked confused, others wary. Captain Miller's mouth opened, then closed. Lieutenant Hall stopped writing mid-note. Allison's throat tightened. She had practiced invisibility for so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. She drew a steady breath. "Lieutenant Commander Allison Webb, ma'am." The words felt foreign, as if she were speaking someone else's name. Her own rank sounded strange after months of being addressed as nothing more than Webb or coordinator. A ripple of realization moved through the room. Confusion, embarrassment, shame. None of them had bothered to know who she really was. North's eyes narrowed, but not with disapproval, with recognition, with confirmation of what she had suspected. "Lieutenant Commander Webb," she said, "would you join us at the table?" It wasn't a request. It was an order softened by courtesy. Allison hesitated, then moved. Every step toward that table felt like stepping out of shadow into sunlight, uncomfortable, exposing, inevitable. She lowered herself into the empty chair beside Lieutenant Hall, posture straight, movements economical. She didn't need to act military. It was in her blood. And now everyone saw it. Master Chief O'Malley's voice crackled from the secure video line. "Admiral, is this one of the cases we've been documenting?" North's answer came without hesitation. "Exactly." The room shifted again. The questions turned toward her, her background, her assignment, her medal. Each answer Allison gave pulled away another layer of the anonymity she had worked so hard to preserve. And then came the question she had feared most. "That medal," Admiral North said softly, "would you mind sharing its significance?" Allison's throat tightened. Her fingers curled against her knees beneath the table. The Navy Cross, the most visible scar of her past. It represented the night in Helmand Province when 15 Marines had bled under her hands, when she had made decisions no one should ever have to make, when she had saved lives and lost pieces of herself she would never get back. For 18 months she had avoided this moment, but here it was, inescapable. Her voice was quiet, steady, clinical, the only way she knew how to tell it without breaking. "Navy Cross, ma'am, awarded for extraordinary heroism during operations in Helmand Province, Afghanistan." The words landed in the room like a detonation underwater, silent, crushing, impossible to ignore. Eyes widened, pens froze. Captain Miller stared as if seeing a ghost. Lieutenant Hall's lips parted, stunned. And Admiral North, she leaned back slightly, studying Allison as though a puzzle had just solved itself. The coffee cups sat cooling on the table, the folders waited unopened, but no one moved. For the first time in 18 months, Allison Webb was no longer invisible. And the life she had tried to bury was stirring back to the surface, whether she wanted it or not. She hadn't wanted the question. She hadn't wanted the memory. But once it was spoken aloud, what unit were you serving with? There was no way back. Her chest tightened. The conference room was quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the projector. Everyone was watching her now. Officers who hadn't remembered her name 15 minutes ago sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed, waiting. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine, Allison said at last. Forward surgical team attached to combat operations in Helmand Province. Her words were matter-of-fact, stripped of emotion, but the silence afterward was loaded, every syllable carrying weight. Admiral North's gaze sharpened, recognition flashing in her eyes. She understood what that meant. She understood the kind of deployment that was. A combat medic, North said, almost to herself. Emergency trauma surgery and casualty evacuation under fire, Allison corrected softly. Not clinic work, battlefield triage. Lieutenant Hall, who had been scribbling furiously, set her pen down. She looked younger suddenly, the way a person does when they realize their world has been too small. Miller shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. Commander Evans rubbed at the bridge of his nose, like a man recalculating everything he thought he knew. And Allison, she just sat still, her posture perfect, her face carefully neutral. Inside, though, her pulse pounded. Every detail they asked for would peel away another layer of the fragile anonymity she'd lived behind for months. Admiral North leaned forward. 15 Marines, wasn't it? The after-action report described. Yes, ma'am. Allison cut her off, not out of disrespect but survival. The less detail, the safer she remained. 15, 3 critical, 7 serious, 5 moderate. And no other medics. Her throat tightened. She forced herself to keep her tone even. No, ma'am, the others were casualties. I was the only one left. 6 hours. 6 endless hours. She didn't need to say it, the record already said it. The Navy Cross on her collar said it louder than words. But sitting in that room, among officers who had dismissed her as a coffee server, she could feel the weight of it pressing harder than ever. O'Malley's voice crackled from the video feed, steady and filled with respect. 6 hours under fire, alone. That's not just medical skill, that's tactical survival. Allison looked down at her folded hands. She hated when people described it that way, like she had been a symbol, a story. She hadn't felt like a symbol. She had felt like a woman on the floor of a dusty forward operating base, hands slick with blood, praying the sound of approaching rotors meant rescue instead of more incoming fire. Lieutenant Commander, Miller finally said, his voice stiff, formal. With your background, why are you here in an administrative role? She lifted her eyes to him. A long pause stretched between them. How could she explain that answer? How could she put words to the fracture between what she had been trained to do and what she could no longer endure? Medical discharge, she said simply. Service-connected injuries, physical, psychological. The word hovered there, unspoken but understood. PTSD. Evans blinked, as though surprised she would admit it aloud. Hall shifted uncomfortably. Kennedy, the chief petty officer, lowered her gaze with quiet respect. North's expression didn't waver. And when you applied here? My background was noted, Allison replied, keeping her voice steady. But the specific nature of my training wasn't considered relevant. I was evaluated for administrative capability. That's all. The Admiral tapped her pen against her folder once, twice. She didn't speak right away, and that silence carried more weight than any reprimand. Around the table, the officers looked at one another, suddenly aware of how blind they had been, not just to Allison, but to the system itself. Then Hall's voice broke the quiet, hesitant but curious. "Ma'am, what specific actions earned you the Navy Cross?" Allison felt the question cut like a blade. She had avoided it for 18 months. She had kept it locked in her chest where no one could touch it, but now it was on the table, and the Admiral was watching her closely. There was no escape. She took a breath. When she spoke, her words came in that careful, clinical rhythm, the only way she knew how to keep the memories from flooding her. Forward operating base, coordinated attack, mortars and small arms. Our primary evac bird was disabled in the opening strike. We had 15 wounded, no evacuation, supplies limited, enemy fire ongoing. Her voice stayed even, but her knuckles whitened against her knees. I performed trauma surgery, triage, and evacuation prep for 6 hours until helicopters could reach us. 3 lives critical. All 3 survived. No one spoke. She stared at the polished table, her reflection faint in its surface. She didn't want their sympathy. She didn't want their awe. She wanted to disappear again, to slide back into the safety of anonymity. But that was impossible now. O'Malley's voice came again, softer this time. "Lieutenant Commander, you saved 15 men under direct fire, alone. That isn't something you bury under coffee duty." The word struck her harder than any bullet, because bury it was exactly what she had done. For 18 months, she had folded that part of herself into a locked box and hidden it under routines. And now, with one shift of her collar, the box had been thrown open for everyone to see. Admiral North's gaze softened just slightly. "Service-connected injuries," she repeated, "physical and psychological." Allison met her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "PTSD." The word was spoken plainly, without judgment. Allison's throat tightened, but she nodded. For a long moment, North didn't speak. She just studied her, measured her, not as an invisible support worker, not as a statistic in a personnel file, but as a soldier who had been through fire, who had carried lives in her hands, and who was still here. Finally, the Admiral leaned back, her voice steady. "We've been wasting you." The words landed like a gavel. Allison's stomach clenched. She didn't want this. She didn't want eyes turning to her, didn't want her scars, visible and invisible, exposed in front of strangers. But North had said it aloud. And once spoken, truth doesn't go back in the bottle. "Captain Miller," North said sharply, her eyes flashing to him, "when was the last time you reviewed the qualifications of the veterans employed under your command?" Miller hesitated, a pause that gave him away before his words even left his mouth. "Ma'am, I rely on department heads." "You rely on others," North cut in, "but you don't look yourself." The captain's silence was damning. Evans shifted in his seat but said nothing. Hall's pen scratched furiously across paper, documenting every word. Allison sat still, heart pounding, caught between 2 worlds, the anonymity she had built and the recognition she could no longer escape. And as Admiral North's questions grew sharper, Allison felt the ground beneath her carefully constructed invisibility crumbling. The truth was surfacing. Her truth, a truth she had never wanted in the open. And deep down, she knew, nothing at Naval Station Beashore would ever be the same again. She thought she could hold her ground at the edge of the table, speak when spoken to, then fade back into the quiet corner where she belonged. But Admiral North had other plans. "Lieutenant Commander Webb," the Admiral said, her voice calm, commanding, "would you describe your current role here at Beashore?" Allison folded her hands. She knew the question wasn't really about her. It was about the system, but now she was the example, the case study, the symbol. "Administrative support, ma'am. I handle logistics for staff meetings, scheduling, correspondence, coffee service." The words sounded hollow even as she spoke them. She saw Captain Miller's jaw tighten. Evans shifted in his chair. Hall looked openly bewildered. They couldn't reconcile the woman who had just described battlefield surgery with the one speaking now about coffee carafes. Admiral North leaned forward, with a Navy cross on your collar. The room was silent again. "Ma'am," Allison said carefully, "I applied for civilian employment after discharge. The hearing process focused on clerical qualifications. My military background was considered relevant." Her voice was steady, but inside her stomach churned. She hated the way it sounded, reduced, minimized, stripped of everything she had been trained to do, but that was the truth of the system. O'Malley's voice cut through the video feed. "Admiral, this is exactly what we've been seeing across the fleet. Combat medics doing clerical work, intelligence analysts filing papers, decorated veterans buried in invisible roles because their resumes don't translate to civilian HR checklists." Hall looked up from her notepad. "It's deliberate or just negligence?" "Neither," Allison said before anyone else could answer. All eyes turned to her again. She kept her gaze level. "It's indifference. The system doesn't know how to read what we bring, so it looks away." Her words hung heavy in the room. Miller frowned. Evans' lips tightened. Kennedy, the chief, lowered her gaze and nodded faintly, as though Allison had just put words to something she'd long suspected. Admiral North's expression didn't change, but her voice carried quiet steel. "Lieutenant Commander, would you be willing to speak about Helmand in more detail?" Allison froze. She wanted to say no. She wanted to refuse, to fold herself back into invisibility. But the Admiral's eyes held hers, unflinching, not as a superior demanding obedience but as a leader asking for truth. And Allison understood. This wasn't about one story. It was about every hidden veteran who had been pushed aside. She drew a slow breath. "We were stationed at Forward Operating Base Jackson, Helmand Province. It was supposed to be a routine operation, security patrols, casualty readiness. Then the attack came." Her voice dropped, softer now, as if speaking to herself. "Mortars first, then small arms. The med tent was hit in the opening volley. Half my team gone in seconds, supplies burning, radios jammed." The images came unbidden. Fire, screaming, blood pooling in the dust. She forced her voice into the calm, clinical cadence she had learned to survive. "We had 15 wounded, critical injuries, amputations, chest wounds, shrapnel, evac helicopter disabled on the landing pad. We were pinned for 6 hours until reinforcements could clear a corridor." Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "I stabilized them one by one, moved between triage and defensive positions, coordinated suppressive fire while running casualty prep. We ran out of IV bags after the second hour, improvised saline, kept pressure on wounds with torn uniforms. Every decision was a gamble. Who got air first if we only had one lift? Who could wait? Who could?" The silence in the room was suffocating. Even the hum of the projector seemed to fade. 15 men survived," Allison said softly. "But 3 of them, I still hear their voices when I close my eyes." She stopped there. She couldn't go further, she wouldn't. O'Malley's voice came low, steady. "Admiral, I've heard hundreds of combat stories. That one belongs in every training manual. But instead she's making coffee." Captain Miller shifted, as if finally realizing the depth of his own failure. He tried to find words, but none came. North didn't speak immediately. She let the silence sit. Then she closed her folder with deliberate precision. "We're done pretending this is acceptable. Captain Miller, within 2 weeks I want a full review of every civilian assignment at this base. Every veteran, every background. I want to know how many Allison Webbs we're wasting." Miller swallowed hard. "Ma'am, that's a significant task." "Then it will require significant effort," North snapped, her patience gone. "We are not in the business of wasting lives twice." The word struck Allison like a hammer. Wasting lives twice. Once on the battlefield, once in bureaucratic neglect. She clenched her fists beneath the table, fighting the surge of emotion that threatened to rise. Hall finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Lieutenant Commander Webb, if you had been asked, if someone had actually listened, what role would have used your training here?" Allison hesitated. She didn't want to answer, but she saw the sincerity in the young lieutenant's eyes, and she owed her honesty. "The medical facility," Allison said quietly. "Trauma training, evac coordination, emergency response planning, all areas they've struggled to fill." The Admiral's eyes glinted. "Exactly the expertise we've been wasting." For the first time, Allison allowed herself to look at Admiral North directly. She wasn't sure what she saw, justice, reform, or simply ruthless efficiency. But one thing was certain, her invisibility was gone. And in its place stood a truth she had spent 18 months trying to outrun. She wasn't just coffee service. She wasn't invisible. She was a veteran, decorated, broken, useful, dangerous. And Admiral Catherine North wasn't going to let her fade into the shadows again. The next morning, Allison stared at her reflection in the mirror longer than usual. The same uniform, the same careful bun, the same neutral expression she had worn for months, but nothing felt the same. She was no longer invisible. The Navy Cross had done what bullets, mortars, and endless therapy sessions couldn't. It had stripped away the shield of anonymity she had built around herself. Admiral North had seen it, had named it, and now the entire command knew. When she walked through the corridors of Building 127, people didn't glance past her anymore. They paused. Some nodded awkwardly. Others whispered. Kennedy offered a respectful "Good morning, Lieutenant Commander," instead of her usual casual "Webb." Even Lieutenant Turner, who had always carried herself with a kind of restless ambition, looked at her with something like awe. And Allison hated it. She hated the spotlight, the weight of expectation that came with it. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted reform. She had wanted coffee duty, paperwork, invisibility, safety. But invisibility had been ripped away. 2 days after the meeting, she was summoned again, this time not to pour coffee but to sit at the table. Admiral North had called for follow-up discussions with senior staff. The agenda was clear: personnel utilization. "Lieutenant Commander Webb," North said once everyone was seated, "your situation is not unique. We've identified dozens of veterans at this installation alone working in positions far beneath their qualifications. We intend to fix that. But first, I want your perspective." The words hit her harder than she expected. Perspective. As if her voice mattered again. She swallowed, her throat tight. "Ma'am, my perspective is complicated." "Good," North replied evenly. "Complications are where truth usually hides." So Allison spoke. Not with speeches, not with rehearsed words. Just truths, simple and painful. She talked about the hearing process, how resumes stripped away the texture of combat roles, how HR staff glanced at medals but didn't understand what they meant, how veterans desperate for stability accepted whatever role was available, even if it erased their expertise. She talked about the quiet humiliation of being treated as furniture in meetings, where she understood more about logistics than the officers giving orders. She spoke of the silence veterans carried, the silence of choosing invisibility, because recognition often came with questions they couldn't bear to answer. When she finished, the room was still. Captain Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Admiral, if I may, these issues stem from standard hearing protocols. Civilian employment operates differently from military assignment." "Standard hearing protocols," North repeated, her voice flat, "are wasting our most valuable resource." Evans tried to defend him. "Admiral, many veterans prefer low-stress positions after discharge. It isn't always neglect. Sometimes it's choice." North's eyes narrowed. "Has anyone asked them, or are we assuming what they want?" Her words cut through the room. Allison's jaw clenched. She had lived those assumptions for 18 months, other people deciding what she wanted, what she could handle without ever asking her. O'Malley's voice carried through the video line from Norfolk. "Admiral, our research confirms it. Veterans aren't being asked. They're being slotted, placed where convenient, and the Navy is bleeding expertise while roles go unfilled." The conversation shifted quickly. Hall scribbled notes furiously. Kennedy managed the flow of documents. Miller looked increasingly cornered, and Allison sat there, caught in the storm, her name and her story becoming the axis around which reform now spun. She felt exposed, raw, like her scars, both seen and unseen, were being paraded as evidence. And yet another part of her, the part that still remembered the battlefield, felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Purpose. But purpose was dangerous. Purpose had nearly broken her once before. 3 days later, she was sitting in Dr. Crawford's office for the first time. The psychologist's walls were lined with diplomas, yes, but also with unit patches, deployment photos, mementos from years spent in combat zones supporting troops. It was the kind of office that spoke both therapy and service. Safe but honest. "Allison," Dr. Crawford said gently, using her first name instead of rank, "I understand Admiral North has asked you to consider roles that use your medical background." Allison shifted uncomfortably in her chair, asked, more like told, "Do you want that?" The question cut deeper than she expected. No one had asked her that, not once. She stared at the floor, tracing the pattern of the carpet with her eyes. "I don't know, part of me wants it, part of me can't breathe thinking about it." "That sounds like truth," Crawford said softly. Allison exhaled. "The admin work, it's safe, predictable, I know what each day brings. No decisions that mean life or death, but it's hollow, it feels like I'm hiding." "And what does going back mean?" Her voice cracked, pressure flashbacks, hands covered in blood again, making the wrong call, failing them this time. Crawford nodded slowly. "Both realities are true. You need purpose, but you also need safety. The question is whether we can design a path that gives you both." Allison closed her eyes. For months she had been surviving, not living, surviving. Could she imagine more? She opened them again. "I don't want to waste what I know, but I don't want to break again." "That," Crawford said with quiet certainty, "is the work we'll do together." Later that week, Allison found herself back in the conference room, this time not just as a symbol, but as a participant in designing the pilot program that would change how veterans were placed in civilian roles. Turner entered breathless, tablet in hand. "Ma'am," she said to North, "we've identified 27 veterans here alone who are underutilized, medics in food service, analysts doing clerical tasks, communications specialists stuck in maintenance." North's jaw tightened, 27 at one base. O'Malley's voice cut in over the comms. "And multiply that across the fleet, we're looking at thousands." Allison felt her stomach twist. 27 people like her, invisible, wasted, forgotten. She wasn't alone, and that knowledge was both comforting and infuriating. Admiral North stood, voice ringing with authority. "Then we fix it. Here now. Be assured we'll be the model. If we can prove it here, we can prove it anywhere." All eyes turned to Allison again. Her chest tightened. She hadn't asked to lead anything, but somehow she had become the proof. The Admiral's words echoed in her mind long after the meeting ended. "We are not in the business of wasting lives twice." That night, alone in her small apartment overlooking the base, Allison sat at her kitchen table with the medal she usually kept tucked away in a drawer. She held it in her palm, its weight familiar and heavy. She whispered to it, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself or to the ghosts it represented. "I didn't ask for this, but maybe it's time." Her reflection in the window stared back at her, weary but unbroken. And for the first time in months, Allison allowed herself to wonder, could stepping back into the light be part of healing, not just breaking? Why was her name suddenly on every schedule? That was the first thing Allison noticed the following week. Before, she had slipped into rooms unmarked, unacknowledged, her presence barely more than background noise. Now her name was printed on rosters, attached to agendas, spoken aloud in briefings. Lieutenant Commander Webb will consult. Lieutenant Commander Webb will advise. Each time she heard it, a piece of her flinched. She hadn't asked for this. She had tried to stay invisible, but Admiral North's storm of reform had swept her into the center whether she wanted it or not. The pilot program was moving fast, faster than Allison believed possible. North wasn't waiting on bureaucracy. She wanted results. She wanted proof that veterans could be placed where they belonged, where their skills mattered, and she wanted it now. "Allison," Kennedy said one afternoon, her voice brisk but tinged with something like admiration, "you're scheduled for the medical facility walkthrough tomorrow. They want your assessment of trauma readiness protocols." Allison froze. The medical facility. The very place she had avoided like a minefield since arriving at Beashore. "Whose idea was that?" she asked quietly. "Admiral." Of course it was. That night Allison lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan above her bed. Every spin of the blades pulled her further back to Helmand. The flicker of fluorescent lights in the med tent, the acrid smell of cauterized wounds, the weight of lives measured in seconds. Her chest tightened. She pressed her palms against her ribs, willing her breathing to steady. She almost called Crawford, almost begged for a note to excuse her from the assignment. But another thought anchored her. If she refused, if she walked away now, she would only prove what Miller and Evans had whispered, that she was broken, unreliable, fragile. She had carried 15 Marines through hell. Surely she could walk through a sterile hospital corridor without collapsing. The next morning she reported to the facility. White walls, clean floors, the faint antiseptic tang in the air. None of it smelled like Helmand, but her body didn't know the difference. Her heart raced. Her palms sweated. Dr. Haskins, the facility director, greeted her with a firm handshake. "Lieutenant Commander Webb, we're honored to have you." She wanted to say, "Don't be." Instead, she forced a polite nod. The tour began. Equipment bays, surgical suites, trauma wards. On the surface, it was modern, well-resourced, organized. But Allison's eyes caught what others missed. Supply chains rooted inefficiently, evac protocols out of sync with helicopter schedules, training gaps in trauma response that would collapse under real fire. By the time they reached the operations wing, she was scribbling notes furiously, not as an administrator, not as a coffee carrier, as a combat medic who had lived the chaos these walls had only simulated. At the final stop, Haskins asked casually, "Would you be willing to run a readiness drill with our staff next week?" The room tilted. A drill, on the surface just training. But in her mind it meant sirens, blood packs, screaming actors. Too close to memory, too close to Helmand. Her throat tightened. "I'll consider it." That night she sat in Crawford's office again, shoulders tense, hands locked. "You're afraid of breaking," Crawford said gently. "I can't go back there," Allison whispered. "Not again." "You're not going back," Crawford replied. "You'd be leading, teaching, turning pain into preparation. There's a difference." Allison shook her head. "I don't know if I can separate the two." Crawford leaned forward. "You don't have to do it alone. You never did. You think the Helmand story is about you being alone, but listen to yourself, Allison. You saved them. They fought because you held the line. You didn't carry that weight instead of them. You carried it with them." The words pressed against her chest, aching but true. The next week, she stood in the center of the trauma ward as the alarm blared. Staff scrambled, simulated casualties rolled in on stretchers, chaos filled the room. Her pulse spiked, sweat slicked her back, and for a split second Helmand flooded her senses, the dust, the blood, the screams. But then she heard something else. Her own voice, calm, steady, commanding. 2 lines of triage, chest wounds to Bay 1, amputations here, prioritize airways, you pressure now move. The staff moved, organized, responded. The chaos began to bend under her direction. By the end of the drill, simulated lives had been saved. Staff looked exhausted but sharper, more cohesive, more confident. And Allison stood in the center, chest heaving, a tremor still in her hands but steel in her voice. Dr. Haskins approached, eyes wide. That was extraordinary. Allison swallowed hard. That was basic survival, and your people need to know it before it's real. For the first time in 18 months, she felt something stir inside her that wasn't fear or shame. It was small, fragile, but real. Purpose. That night she sat again with the medal in her palm. This time she didn't whisper apologies to it. She didn't curse it. She just held it quietly like a weight she could maybe, just maybe, carry again. But purpose came with danger. She knew that. Purpose had teeth. And as Admiral North's reforms gained traction, Allison could feel the storm building around her. She wasn't just part of the program anymore. She was becoming its face. And faces drew fire. Why was her face suddenly on a briefing slide? That was the first question that stopped Allison cold the following Monday. She had walked into the secure conference room expecting another round of reform discussions. Instead, the projector screen lit up with photographs of veterans in civilian roles, each paired with notes about their backgrounds and underutilized expertise. Analysts, mechanics, cryptographers, and at the center of the slide deck her. Lieutenant Commander Allison Webb, Navy Cross recipient. Combat Medic, Helmand Province. Current assignment, administrative support. She froze. Her stomach dropped. The photograph wasn't even official. It was a candid someone had taken of her serving coffee months earlier. Her hands curled into fists. What is this? Admiral North's voice was steady. Illustration. Every program needs a human face. Yours speaks louder than any statistic. Allison's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to demand they remove her image, her name, her story. But the room was filled with commanders, department heads, policymakers, all eyes on her. Evans cleared his throat. Ma'am, I'd caution against putting too much weight on a single individual. Visibility brings scrutiny. Scrutiny, North replied, is precisely what we need. Miller shifted uncomfortably. With respect, Admiral Lieutenant Commander Webb has been through enough. Turning her into a symbol could. Allison cut him off, her voice sharp. I'm right here. Stop talking like I'm not. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't planned, but for the first time she had claimed space in the conversation. Her chest tightened with the shock of it. North's gaze met hers. Then tell us, Lieutenant Commander, do you want your story used? The room held its breath. Allison stared at the screen. At her own image, blurred coffee tray in hand, Navy Cross glinting faintly at her collar. She hated it. Hated the exposure, the vulnerability. But she also thought of the 27 names Turner had uncovered. 27 wasted lives at this base alone. How many more across the fleet? Her voice was low, steady. If it forces you to look at the people you're ignoring, then yes, use it. North gave a single nod. Then we moved forward. From that day on, her invisibility was gone. Within weeks, Beashore's pilot program became a fleet-wide talking point. Reports circulated. Policy memos drafted. Allison's story was referenced in speeches, in training sessions, even in congressional briefings. She heard her own name on news segments, though she avoided watching. At the base, recognition followed her everywhere. Salutes she no longer rated, handshakes from strangers, whispered gratitude in the commissary line. And with recognition came pressure. You're the reason this is happening, Turner said one afternoon, her tone admiring. People are finally paying attention. Allison wanted to say, I didn't ask for this, but the words stuck in her throat, because whether she asked or not, it was true. Yet not everyone celebrated. In the hallways, she caught murmurs, officers who resented being called out, veterans who bristled at being represented by her story instead of their own, administrators who muttered about disruption, extra paperwork, increased scrutiny. Miller, especially, grew colder by the day. He still attended North's reform meetings, but his support was clipped, reluctant. She could feel his disapproval like a shadow. One evening, Kennedy stopped her outside the office. "Careful, Webb, you're rattling cages." "I didn't shake them," Allison said softly. "North did." Kennedy gave a half-smile. "Doesn't matter. People will blame the face they can see." Those words haunted her. That night, sitting alone in her apartment, Allison found herself staring at the medal again. She had begun to leave it on the table instead of locking it away. Some nights she hated it. Some nights she touched it like a lifeline. Tonight she whispered, "What if they're right? What if I'm not strong enough for this?" The silence answered back, as it always did. Days blurred into weeks. Meetings, drills, interviews she never agreed to but somehow found herself giving. Every time she spoke, she measured each word carefully, terrified of becoming a slogan, a caricature. She wanted nuance, truth, honesty, but the machine of reform didn't always allow for nuance. One evening, after a particularly draining session, Crawford asked her gently, "What scares you more, being invisible again or being visible forever?" The question stunned her. She didn't answer, she couldn't. But she carried it with her. And then came the first backlash. An anonymous letter slid under her office door. Sloppy handwriting, bitter words. "You think you're saving us. You're just putting a target on our backs. Some of us wanted quiet. You took it away." Her chest clenched as she read it. She couldn't tell if it was resentment, fear, or both, but it pierced her more deeply than praise ever could. That night she walked the base alone, the ocean whined sharp against her face. She thought of the Marines in Helmand. She thought of the silence she had built for 18 months. She thought of the 27 names and all the others like them. And for the first time, she admitted something to herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was bigger, messier, dangerous. Admiral North had started a fire, but Allison Webb had become the flame everyone could see. And flames, she knew, always burned hottest before they burned out. Why did the applause feel like gunfire? That was the thought that echoed through Allison's chest as she stood on the auditorium stage, the lights hot on her face, the sound of clapping bouncing off the walls like ricochets. She hadn't wanted to be here. Admiral North had insisted. "If the fleet is going to understand the reform, they need to hear it from the people living it," she had said, which really meant they need to hear it from you. So here she was, standing at a podium, Navy Cross on her collar, recounting the Helmand story for the 100th time. Except this time it wasn't a private room of officers. It was an auditorium filled with sailors, civilians, veterans, policymakers. She kept her voice even, clinical, detached. The facts were the same, but each retelling scraped against her ribs like shrapnel that hadn't been removed. She had learned to numb herself to it, but under the spotlight, numbness was harder to hold. When she finished, the applause hit, loud, relentless. And inside she felt herself flinch, not because she didn't appreciate it, but because it felt like a wall of noise between her and the memory of the men she'd fought for. They didn't clap that night in Helmand. They screamed. They bled. They begged. As the applause thundered, Allison's pulse spiked. The edges of the room blurred. For a second, she wasn't in the auditorium at all. She was back in the dust and chaos, the smell of blood thick in her lungs. Her hand tightened around the podium. "Steady. Breathe, don't break." When the lights dimmed and the audience filtered out, she sat alone in the back row, chest heaving. Turner found her there. "You were incredible," the young lieutenant said softly. Allison shook her head. "I was exposed." Turner frowned. "That's the point. People can't change what they don't see." Allison didn't answer. She couldn't explain to Turner that being seen was its own kind of wound. That night she skipped Crawford's session. She didn't want to talk, didn't want to open the floodgates again. Instead, she walked along the shoreline, the Pacific roaring like artillery in her ears. She whispered to the waves, "I can't keep doing this." But the machine kept moving. Over the next weeks, Beashore's pilot program expanded. Veterans reassigned to medical, intelligence, communications. Training revamped. Evac protocols rewritten. Reports showed measurable improvement in readiness. And always, Allison's name was at the center. She started receiving letters. Some were grateful, veterans thanking her for giving them back purpose. Families saying their loved ones had finally been recognized, but others were bitter. "Not all of us want to be your symbol. You're making us a headline when we just wanted peace. We didn't ask for you to speak for us." Each letter cut her differently. Gratitude weighed heavy, resentment even heavier. She carried both like stones in her chest. Then came the resistance from within. One afternoon, she walked into the medical facility to find a group of staff whispering near the supply racks. They froze when they saw her. One of them, a petty officer, muttered just loud enough for her to hear, "Here comes the Admiral's project." Project, not person, not veteran, not leader, project. The word hit harder than the letters. She carried it into Crawford's office that evening, shoulders tense, voice brittle. "They don't see me. They see a policy experiment." Crawford leaned back, studying her. "Maybe, but experiments prove things. You're proving something they can't ignore." "I didn't ask to prove anything." "No," Crawford said gently, "but sometimes the burden chooses you." Allison stared at the floor. She wanted to argue, but deep down she knew Crawford was right. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. Admiral North had arranged a live-streamed panel for the entire fleet. Allison was on stage again, flanked by policymakers and senior officers. Questions came rapid fire: success rates, implementation hurdles, resource allocation. Then one officer from the audience stood. His voice was sharp, almost accusing. "Lieutenant Commander Webb, with respect, what gives you the right to speak for all of us? Not every veteran wants to be thrown back into the fight. Some of us chose quiet for a reason. Why should your story dictate the rest of ours?" The room tensed, cameras rolled, every eye was on her. For a heartbeat, Allison froze. The words she had dreaded were finally spoken aloud. Her chest ached. She thought of the letters, the whispers, the resentment, and for once she didn't want to hide behind clinical detachment. Her voice was low, unpolished, raw. "I don't speak for everyone, I never claimed to. I barely speak for myself most days, but I know what it feels like to be invisible, to have your skills, your sacrifices, your life reduced to paperwork and coffee duty. And I know I'm not the only one. That's why I speak. Not because I want to, but because someone has to." The silence afterward was thick. The officer lowered his gaze. The cameras caught every word. North's eyes glinted with approval, but Allison didn't feel victorious. She felt hollow, drained. That night, back in her apartment, she collapsed onto the couch and let herself cry for the first time in months. Not just for herself, for every veteran whose story was being twisted, ignored, or weaponized. She whispered into the empty room, "I don't want to be their symbol. I just want to be human again." But deep down, she knew the choice was no longer hers. She was the face of the storm now. And storms don't stop just because the wind wants rest. Why was it so quiet after the storm? That was the question pressing against Allison's chest as she walked across the parade grounds one early morning, the fog still clinging to the asphalt, the flags snapping faintly in the breeze. Months had passed since the Admiral noticed her Navy Cross. Months since she'd been pulled from the shadows of anonymity and forced into the blinding light of reform. And now, for the first time, things had slowed. Not because the work was over, no, the work was only beginning, but because the machine she had helped set in motion was running on its own. The pilot program at Beashore had been declared a success. Reports showed improvements in readiness, morale, retention. Veterans who had once been wasted in invisible roles were now instructors, analysts, medics, leaders again. The model was spreading fleet-wide. And Allison, she was still here, not hidden, not erased, not invincible either, but here. Admiral North had offered her a formal role, Director of Veteran Integration Programs, a title with weight, a position that would keep her at the center of the reform she had unwillingly sparked. But the offer sat unanswered on her desk. She had spent nights staring at it, torn between two truths. One, she had purpose here. Her scars meant something, carried weight that could change lives. Two, every step deeper into visibility risked breaking her all over again. Crawford asked her once, "What does healing mean to you?" She hadn't known how to answer then. But now, walking across the fog-draped grounds, she thought maybe healing wasn't a destination at all. Maybe it was learning to live in the tension, to carry both the medal and the coffee tray, both the battlefield and the office, both the pain and the purpose. Later that morning, she entered the trauma ward again, not as a patient, not as a survivor, as a teacher. The staff was gathered for another drill. This time, Allison didn't freeze at the sound of the alarms. She didn't drown in the flood of memory. She moved with calm authority, guiding the chaos into order, teaching the way only someone who had lived the real thing could teach. When it was over, one of the young corpsmen approached her, eyes wide with admiration. "Ma'am, I've read about Helmand. I never thought I'd learn from someone who was there." Allison met his gaze. For once, she didn't feel the weight of being a symbol. She felt human. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need to be me. You just need to be ready when it counts." The corpsman nodded, his expression steadying. Afterward, Allison stepped outside. The fog had burned away, leaving the California sky a sharp, endless blue. She breathed deep, the air clear in her lungs. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table with the Navy Cross in front of her. She didn't lock it away. She didn't clutch it like an apology. She simply let it rest there, part of her life but not all of it. She picked up a pen and signed the Admiral's offer, not because she wanted to be the face of reform, not because she wanted to be remembered, but because she couldn't ignore what she had seen: veterans reclaiming purpose, lives restored, shadows lifted. The next day, she delivered the signed paper to North. The Admiral read it, gave a single nod, and said only 4 words: "You'll do great things." But Allison didn't want great things. She wanted quiet things, human things, a balance between being seen and being whole. Weeks later, during a small ceremony, she stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as other veterans received recognition for their new roles. Medics teaching trauma courses, analysts briefing operations, engineers leading maintenance reforms, each of them stepping into the light in their own way. Allison stayed near the back where she preferred, but this time, invisibility wasn't a shield, it was a choice. As the crowd dispersed, Turner found her. "Why don't you go up front, ma'am? You started this." Allison shook her head, a faint smile on her lips. "No, they did. I just stopped hiding." Turner looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, understanding. That night, Allison walked the shoreline again. The ocean roared steady and endless, the same as it always had. She thought of the Marines in Helmand, of the lives she had carried through dust and fire. She thought of the coffee trays, the meetings, the whispers of dismissal. She thought of the applause that had felt like gunfire and the quiet gratitude of a young corpsman who simply wanted to be ready. And she realized something. Her life was no longer defined by the extremes, not just battle or silence, not just invisibility or spotlight. It was the fragile, complicated middle, broken but still standing, haunted but still moving. She paused, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She whispered into the night, not to the metal, not to the ghosts, but to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And with that, Allison turned back toward the base lights in the distance, still carrying her scars, still uncertain, but finally walking with something she hadn't felt in years. Hoping.